So with that, I'm very excited to introduce tonight's presenters. Miriam Lewin has made documentary shorts on topics ranging from housing discrimination in Georgia to the 50th anniversary of undergraduate co-ed singing at Yale. She also writes and produces radio programs on classical music and is developing a science podcast. Miriam's first career was in opera administration, and she manages the world's oldest collection of opera super titles. Okay. And Rabbi Kevin Hale, who is a Sofer Stam, his work includes evaluating, restoring Torah scrolls, writing Megillot and Mezuzot, and teaching about Judaism's sacred scribal traditions. He follows in the footsteps of his teacher, Rabbi Dr. Eric Ray, as a scribe authorized to repair the Czech Torah scrolls of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, now loaned to communities throughout the world. A deeply curious tinkerer, he invents musical instruments, makes recordings without electricity, and bakes his own matzah. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Miriam and Kevin.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've never expected to be in this position at this hour. And we are going to start with showing the film, which is 23 minutes long. And then Rabbi Hale and I will hope you guys have questions.
That was wonderful. Okay, so I know that Miriam has a couple things she wants to say before we, I guess, start with some Q&A. So if you have questions, you can start, or comments, you can start sharing them in the chat. So Miriam, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Fink. I just want to start off by saying people often ask me what I learned making this film. And the answer is that I learned everything that you saw I didn't know. So I didn't know there were 613 commandments. And I certainly didn't know that the last one was that you should write the scroll for yourself. And I didn't know that kosher applied to anything other than food. I certainly didn't know it applied to Torahs. And by the way, the opposite of kosher for a Torah is pasul. And I don't know whether pasul applies to anything else. Maybe one of the rabbis can tell us. I didn't know how old these Torahs get to be. I think Rabbi Hale told me that he worked with one from the 1300s, which just boggles my mind. Anyway, those are just a few of the things I learned. And making the film really deepened my connection to being Jewish, and I hope that in some way it will do that for you too. As the film said, there are 1,564 of these scrolls from Czechoslovakia that are loaned out through the Memorial Scrolls Trust to educational institutions, libraries, summer camps, museums, but mostly synagogues. They are in 28 countries: South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, and a recently discovered one in India that had somehow gotten there from Australia and had been lost track of. But there are about 1,000 in the USA. And I actually want to ask you guys, the viewers, who was familiar with the memorial, these Czech scrolls before? Do you have one at your synagogue? Have you encountered one someplace else? So you can either put that in the chat, or you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and tell us about it. Because I'm always curious, especially with a group like this that's from so many different congregations, I assume. Missy says there's one in Toronto that I know of. I'm actually talking to somebody in Toronto about possibly doing a presentation there. That'd be great. There are answers coming in. We have one in Montclair. That's great. And questions are starting. So that was just a little warm up. I sort of wanted to get a sense of the audience, whether you guys knew anything about these scrolls before. So I will turn it back to you, Rabbi, I think, to handle the questions.
Sure. So the first question is, were the Torahs deliberately harmed or just aged by their journey?
You know, Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed it's a question for me.
It's for you.
Because there are powerful myths associated with these scrolls, and then there's kind of mundane reality, and what really has happened is probably somewhere in between. So one of the great myths is that the Nazis wanted to make a museum to the extinct Jewish race, and that they were somehow responsible for cataloging them. And fortunately, it seems that really it was the dedicated work of these of the museum workers, or the myth that they were grabbed and blood spilled on them, and then there's the mundane thing, which is, well, they were found essentially warehoused when the Czech government wanted to raise money. And really, the fact is, we don't know. But in the scrolls that I've examined, 100 or so, all told, really the damage seems to be from neglect. When a scroll is left in a damp place for 20 years, things happen. But here and there, you might see that there's some fire damage, but we don't know. We don't really want to presume to know how the damage happened. But I don't think that the scrolls were intentionally desecrated in that sort of cinematic way that one might imagine. But some are in very poor condition from years of neglect.
So there's a question about what's the point that a Torah is no longer kosher or can't be repaired, perhaps? And then related to that, about when is it good for the Torah to end up in a museum as opposed to be actually in circulation, or even be the third one in the back of the ark, so it's kind of potentially available, but not the one that's read every week.
Okay, this is such a perfect question that encompasses all the questions. The first part, I think, is somewhat simpler, which is that there's a set of guidelines, that they're very old, about those, try to use the same tone always, 304,805 letters in the Torah, and if one is illegible, it isn't kosher at that time. It could be one letter corrected, made kosher again. There's structural damage that could make a Torah not kosher, like a tear running through the text in a way that breaks up the integrity of words and, for all practical purposes, can't be repaired. Rabbi, repeat the second part, because that's where it really opens up.
Yeah, so the question was about,
that
if you can't, when is a Torah too damaged to repair or not worth it, and then what happens?
Okay,
what do you is it better for it to be like in the back of an ark or in a museum display case, or what's your thoughts about that?
So if a Torah is no longer kosher and it is not practical to repair it, and I think ever since we started writing Torah, it's been quite an investment of our time and resources and love and attention. So a scroll such as the one I'm restoring for a congregation in Woodstock, Vermont, is so beyond repair that to be kosher, so there are panels that the mold has just made the parchment actually tear apart. It's dangerous black mold was once there. Yes, in theory, you could rewrite 10 or more of those panels, but often, a scroll needs a certain amount of work. So the question is really, and I have to say this is actually the subject of my doctoral project, which is, at what point should one of the Czech Torahs that has such a resonance with our history not be made to have to be restored to be functioning as a kosher Torah. When a sacred object is no longer usable, the traditional options are geniza in the form of we store it away. You could keep it in the ark. I love that idea. Keep it in the back row, dance with it at Simchat Torah. We can learn from it. This is essentially what the Woodstock congregation is saying. We still want to look through the scroll, and we could even read from it in a non-service setting. It deserves to be danced with, I think. And then there's the option of burying. And it's not my saying that yesterday I was at the funeral of my father, lived to 99, thank God. And as part of the burial, we added sacred things, pieces of Torah, sacred texts into the grave. And that's a way that we give respect to a Torah that's no longer really able to live as a person. And that is done with Torah scrolls. So the last part of your question is, well, we probably don't want to do that with these scrolls. They also have this historical value. So how do we keep them in a museum or in a synagogue that's clearly beyond the point at which it would be appropriate or even sort of respectful to make it act like a kosher Torah? So it's a beautiful question, and frankly, Rabbi, I've been unpacking this question for about 20 years. That's why I went on so long.
Right. Working through the questions. Ori is interested for advice about studying Zofrut, and Ori is just starting doing that.
And, Ori should feel free to through chat or through Rabbi Fink, get my email, and I'd be happy to advise you. There actually are so many options now that there weren't just 20 years ago when I started learning from my teacher, blessed memory.
So tell us a little bit about the eights, the wooden scroll holders. What can you tell us about anything about them that'd be interesting, and then also how they'd be restored or replaced?
Way of thinking of it is that the Sefer Torah itself is made with ingredients that are discussed all the way back 2,000 years ago. And as you move away from the Torah itself, there's a lot more latitude about the rollers or the mantle. I'll say that there's two main ways that we've had Torahs on rollers, and one is the way that's most common in the Ashkenazi world. Two Torahs and lying flat and rolling, and then in the world of North Africa and the Middle East, and in some communities still, in a teak upright, and the Torah stays in the teak. And rather than having discs top and bottom, you kind of twirl the top and roll through the scroll. So the question is, do they matter? Do they not? One of the sort of sad things as I visit synagogues is there's an incredible old scroll and it's on a brand new set of rollers. These days they tend to be made from wood and overseas and then assembled. But often older rollers also have dedication information and written either on the top disc or, as in the case of this amazing scroll from Oklahoma City that I'm working on, the wood has an inset, and around the bottom disc, it'll say, this was like in synagogues all over, this is dedicated in honor of so-and-so. So it's really, it's always a question about, are the rollers at Atzei Chaim historically significant or related to the original scroll, or were they just taken from another place and added on? So it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Another question is about mistakes in the Torah. So if you are either, and I'm going to phrase it, that either you're writing something, and I'll even say, like, if you're writing any kind of sacred text, if you're writing mezuzah or tefillin or Torah scroll and you make a mistake, what do you do? And then also related that if you're preparing a Torah, you're checking it, and it's not even that it like you can't read the letter anymore. There's like a mistake. How do you handle that?
Well, it depends, because there's sort of a generosity that says the Torah is presumed to be kosher until a mistake were to be found, and that's because after Stam, Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah, or really Megillah and other things like that are written, they are thoroughly checked, and traditionally 3 times checked by someone other than the scribe. And corrections use computer scanning. So at that point, you can safely assume that if there's a Sefer Torah in front of you, you don't need to research who wrote it or when and was it checked. But when you find a mistake, usually can be corrected. And the easiest correction that I made was there was a piece of lint that fell on the left-hand side of the letter bet, and it looked like a mem sofit. And I plucked it off, and it was back to being a bet. But it is possible to scrape away letters and rewrite. And if you look at a scroll, you might find a place where the letters are stretched or squished together because those were corrections. One tends to be very careful to minimize that, though.
Great. Other questions in the chat? Not really a question. There's a comment about program Project Kesher, which places Torah scrolls in the former Soviet Union. Mars giving them a plug.
I had the pleasure of this is many years ago, actually, towards the beginning of my my work of assessing and doing some repairs, and just the idea that Eastern Europe, which was where most of our older Torahs in America come from, that there was a lack of kosher Torahs in emerging congregations is really quite thrilling, and they come from here.
Okay, we have a question about any etymological analysis of the demonic name crossed out before writing a Torah. So
I will translate that as Amalek, as referred to, and there's a custom of crossing out Amalek's name because of the commandment. You should blot out the memory of Amalek, like we would drown out the sound of Haman's name. And Miriam, I don't remember if this was in the 23 minutes or in the other 32 hours of your filming, that something that I love is the gematria, the numerical equivalent, in which if you add up the value of the word Amalek and the word doubt, it seemed, if I remember right, is the same. So crossing out and obliterating, I love it, the demonic name, the name of Amalek, is also for me a way of remembering I'm going to set aside my doubt and put on my chutzpah and get to work. But it's that custom. I believe that in the days of fountain pens and bar mitzvahs, today I'm a fountain pen, that the first thing you do is write Amalek's name with your fountain pen on the bottom of your shoes and stamp it out. Similar.
So, Kevin, what's been your experience being a Reconstructionist rabbi in the world of doing this? Where my sense before thinking of you and like other folks who I know some women who are becoming sofers or a soferet, I guess in that case. You think about who's repairing a Torah, who's writing tefillin, who's doing that. And my image is is, vary from, guys, right? And so what is that like for you? And then also women who are entering into this world, how is that working?
So, I don't know where to begin. When this film began, I was actually at the beginning of the process of transitioning and joining the Rabbinical Assembly. So after about 20 years in the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, I was actually really delighted to join the Rabbinical Assembly. And the reason is that I came up against a theological wall. Reconstructionism is this very, very powerful idea of really human-centered Judaism. And I was like going to congregations like the one that was filmed at, and asking this question of, like, if we're committed to the idea that really it's not a supernatural source of Torah, that it's, it comes from the holiness of the Jewish people, then why are we bothering doing this? And that drew me, frankly, to a much more traditional way of thinking about what's the source of Torah. And for those of you familiar with Reconstructionism, it's really an amazing American invention. It invented the bat mitzvah and everything. And Mordecai Kaplan, the founder, never mentioned this enterprise of writing Torah. And I think it was in a great blind spot, because there's great theologies that can't quite account for why we have invested so much into copying our Torahs by hand. There's been plenty of other technologies that might be more practical. And I think it's it's explained more by a sense of, these are the words of God that Moses wrote down and we copied. So that part of it is, I think like a Reconstructionist, but it actually, frankly, it'll help us think creatively about how the world is evolving. We're in this strange world in which something that I think every community did, whether they wore black or not, is mostly done in rarefied worlds. And my teacher's dream, and mine too, is that the writing of Torah becomes something normal and worthwhile in any community. Let's talk, Rabbi. I think maybe you should be working on some fruit in a Reconstructionist context.
Great. There's a question about calligraphy, and about it's saying the favorite calligraphic font to work in when you start a new scroll. And I guess so however you want to interpret that, how, do you have a particular, if you're writing your own text, do you have a particular style of calligraphy that you use? And then also, if you're repairing a scroll, I'm assuming you're trying to match whatever the style is that the scroll was in, if you're replacing a panel or something like that.
Precisely. So when I talk about playing with pay, those were practicing the script of that panel that needed to be rewritten. And even when doing repairs, as much as possible, following the original script. I sort of have my teacher, a blessed memory, Eric Ray, really knew hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of styles of writing. And I know probably a few dozen. But there's the Beit Yosef. It's kind of the most recognizable Ashkenazi script that I would write in normally, and I tend to lean towards a German version. My family is from Germany, or the place that was called Germany for a while, and it has a lot of upright scripts, and we like that uprightness. But my favorite, to be honest, is the style of writing that I was using in the rewriting of that panel. And it is based on a medieval Spanish script and was used in the Portuguese congregation in Hamburg that my family actually was part of. And I even had an ancestor who had such a Spanish name that it's sort of that link. And you know, it's really the kind of writing that inspired sort of the modern Hebrew typeface. So it's kind of airy, and what you're seeing in that is a style of writing that was meant for using a stick or a reed pen on like the smooth skin of leather, but instead doing that with a quill on the velvety inside of parchment. But frankly, it just connects to me with thinking about my great-grandfather who belonged to the Spanish-Portuguese congregation. And I tell you, every once in a while, you know, we'll have a session and someone said, my great-grandfather was a Sofer. And I'll say, where do they come from? And they don't necessarily know. Well, if you send me a sample of their text, I can tell you something about the region that they came from. And that's very exciting to me.
Great. I think I've gotten to most, if not all, the questions from the chat. If anybody else has any other questions or comments, you can also share them in the chat as well. Okay. Oh, how did this become a film? Yeah. So what's the story of how this film came to be, Miriam?
Well, I've known Rabbi Hale for a very long time because he is, in fact, my first cousin. And a couple of years ago, he was telling me about the work that he does with these particular scrolls. And I was fascinated, and I said, that sounds like a movie. And he said, oh, okay. And then I made him sit to be filmed for off and on over several years. And I don't know if he regrets saying okay, but but it was a lot of fun making this film. And I just want to say, I know we're getting close to the end. I want to thank him for joining us tonight. He's had a very long day. As he just sort of glossed over, his father died this week and was buried this morning, and he had probably the world's shortest Shiva because Shiva ends with the beginning of the holiday. And he wanted to come and sort of restart by doing this teaching and learning together. So I'm very grateful to him.
Miriam, have you shown the film in different places? What's been the reception? I mean, the places that you have.
We've shown the film at about 10 Jewish film festivals and 1 non-Jewish film festival. The reception has been really moving. And so far at about 25 synagogues in sessions like this with a screening and a Q&A. I mean, to be honest, distribution in time of lockdown has been quite rewarding. And if any of you who said you have scrolls or you know about scrolls, if any of you would like to ask to do this kind of a screening, please contact me, Miriam at commandment613.com, and I'd love to talk to you about setting up a session. And next year we'll be releasing it for educational use because I think the film will have a useful life in religious schools at all levels.
And we can take the last minute or so. There are requests for Kevin, if you would like to share anything about your father.
Well, since we didn't get to have a long shiva, you know, there's nothing I'd rather do. Can I show you? I think he was a really handsome guy. But you know, there was I belong to a conservative synagogue here in Northampton, Massachusetts. And there's probably about 12 rabbis there. Anyway, and this is back in 2006 or 7, and we actually got our first new Torah, and I was the scribe doing the part of, you know, the go between the congregation and the really modestly paid scribe in Israel who actually wrote it. So we had the Siyum celebration, the great celebration of finishing the last letters, and my father came for that. It was really, I would say, the first time that he, you know, ventured out after a year of mourning. And earlier that day, we went to this festival in the park, and we got to go, you know, up and down on a hot air balloon, you know, that's tethered. And then he was honored with the writing of a letter, and he just commented about like how thrilling it was to do something for the first time. And then I taught my father about what Shehechianu means. So there's one. And if anyone wants to learn more about my father, please, I would love to talk about it. Miriam, what is that you brought out?
Well, and this is a scroll work. It's actually a napkin holder, I think, but it's beautiful, and it's got an image of cherries in it. And this was his gift to us for our wedding, and I treasure it. He loved to make things. He was an engineer. He made things. He built things. He fixed things, and actually, that's where Kevin, I think, gets that from, that tactile making things gift.
Well, I just want to, you know, thank you both so much, Kevin, especially at this, you know, with everything that's going on, and Miriam, wonderful film.
Thank you.
So thank you all for this wonderful coming to this session.